Good morning. I wanted to start by saying hello. My name is Carole. Today, it's my privilege to chair our 5th plenary together at what I must say, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, has been an extraordinary and wonderful conference. From the programme, you'll see we have another excellent speaker this morning coming, Dr. Gail. Once she's concluded and responded to your questions, we have one further treat for you all, though. Heather Richardson, the CEO at St Christopher's, has got 2 pieces of good news to share with us, and she'll be coming to the stage once we've thought about our questions for Gail. However, announcements aside, our core reason for being here in Hall 1A this morning is to hear the wisdom and insight of Dr. Gail. Those of you who are not familiar with her work, I can tell you that Gail is an OT, an academic at Brunel University, and a well-known provocative thinker. And today, she will focus our thinking and provoke us to consider some questions. What it means to live well, taking us through an exploration of concepts of self-esteem, self-efficacy, and identity in the midst of a setting of serious illness. So without going on any further, I'd like you to welcome Dr. Gail.
Good morning, everybody. That sounds like a very tall order, but thank you, Carole. I kind of feel like actually mostly what I'm going to be doing is telling you some stories. The talk this morning is about maintaining a sense of identity and competence and self-worth in the context of life-limiting illness. And I guess that makes it about rehabilitation because, in essence, that's what rehabilitation is. But I want to do more than simply say that rehabilitation is a great thing and our patients should have more of it. It is, and they should. But this morning I want to try to give you an insight into how people living with life-limiting illness, the people that we work with, how they experience disability, and I want to show you how a rehabilitation approach, which is something that we can all do, it's not just the domain of allied health professionals or rehabilitation specialists, how a rehabilitation approach can make a positive difference to people's ability to live life to the full, whatever that means for them, for as long as they're able. So thank you very much to Roz and to the conference organisers for inviting me to wonderful Liverpool and giving me the opportunity to talk to you. And in return, I bring greetings from down south and Brunel University, where I work. Brunel, for those of you who are wondering, is on the western outskirts of London, and for the most part, we have a very lovely campus. We do, however, have the dubious privilege of being home to one of the most notable specimens of 1960s brutalist architecture in the UK. Our main lecture centre is a building so grim and so sinister that Stanley Kubrick chose it as the setting for the torture scene in his classic film, A Clockwork Orange. There you go, little fun fact for the day. The scene was in fact filmed in Lecture Theatre E, the one in this picture, which by coincidence is the exact lecture theatre where I teach my Wednesday afternoon introduction to statistics class, and my students tell me they know exactly how Alex feels. This is another university, a world away from England. Does anybody recognise it? No one's going to be brave enough and put their hands up. It's Cape Town, South Africa, and where I grew up and trained to be an occupational therapist. And the University of Cape Town is probably the most beautiful one in the world, and this is almost just a completely gratuitous picture of it. After I'd qualified, I worked for several years in spinal injuries in Cape Town and also here in Khayelitsha, in the community. And without wanting to be lengthily and boringly and unnecessarily autobiographical, I mention this because it provides some context for some of the things that I want to say this morning about disability. This was in the mid to late 1980s, so just before the release in 1990 of Nelson Mandela, and it was a period of considerable upheaval and turmoil in South Africa. People who had suffered the oppression of decades of apartheid were finding a voice, organizing themselves, protesting both peacefully and not so peacefully about political and social injustice. And this militancy in politics had a ripple effect, most notably for me. It prompted activism in other areas, the campaign for rights for people with disabilities. And the South African Disabled People's Alliance was founded in 1984, and it was here that I first encountered the social model of disability. As a newly qualified, shiny, enthusiastic therapist, I was full of enthusiasm about the good work that I could do, and I was rather taken aback at that stage to be told by the spinal injured people that I worked with that I was actually more part of the problem than I was part of the solution. Disability receives remarkably little attention in the palliative care literature, with the notable exception of a series of papers published in the Journal of Palliative Medicine in 2006 by Harvey Chochinov and Deborah Steinstra. Beyond this, there's very little discussion of how disability might be conceptualized in the context of people who have life-limiting illness. And in particular, there's been almost no reference to mainstream disability studies, and ideas that are familiar to disability theorists are not widely recognized in palliative care. So I want briefly to contrast two models which are established in disability studies, the social model and what we're going to refer to as the traditional model. In the traditional model, disability is seen as a problem for individuals. It's a health condition requiring the attention of health professionals to be fixed or cured or palliated. It's a model that focuses our attention on what an individual cannot do and cannot be. The social model, by contrast, sees disability as a result of the interaction between people living with an impairment and an environment that's filled with social barriers, social and physical barriers. So the implication here is that our efforts to reduce disability shouldn't focus on individuals, but rather on the need to change the environments that people are living in, to make it possible for people living with impairments to participate in society on an equal basis with everyone else. Its focus is on changing society to accommodate the person living with the impairment rather than changing the person to accommodate society. In a nutshell, the problem is not that someone can't walk. The problem is that buildings are inaccessible for things with wheels, like wheelchairs and, of course, Daleks. So I learned early on in my career as an occupational therapist that meaningful change had to focus at least as much on social and attitudinal barriers as it did on supporting individuals. Where does palliative care come into all of this? Let's focus our attention for a moment on what's important to people at the end of life. A number of research studies show us that patients want their symptoms to be well managed, their care to be well coordinated, to avoid the inappropriate prolongation of dying. They want to be able to maintain a sense of control, achievement, and self-worth. To relieve the burden on others. Strengthening relationships with loved ones is important, as is the opportunity to say goodbye and bring closure. Look at the list on the right-hand side of your screen. They're the ones that are particularly affected by increasing disability that patients experience towards the end of life, and therefore the ones that have particular relevance for rehabilitation. What do we mean then when we're talking about a rehabilitation approach in the context of palliative care? The lovely lady in this picture is my 87-year-old mother-in-law. It was taken at the top of Sugarloaf, a little mountain in the Brecon Beacons in Wales, just this last summer. 18 months previously, she'd had surgery and radiotherapy for bowel cancer. Rehabilitation is about looking at people's priorities. What do they need to do every day? What do they want to do, which are not necessarily the same things? Someone might need to be able to get up and washed and dressed, but what they want to do, what my mum-in-law wanted to do, was to get to the top of a mountain, a family activity that she'd loved throughout her life and that was important to her. Rehabilitation is about enabling people to match their needs and their goals and aspirations with their capabilities and resources. However, it's not just about the capabilities and resources of individuals. Remember the social model of disability that I was talking about a minute ago. Disability is the result of the interaction between people living with impairments and an environment filled with social, physical, and attitudinal barriers. And as a family, we spent quite a bit of time suggesting to my mother-in-law that the flatter, less risky, less likely to end up in A&E with a hip fracture, that nice flat walk next to the river up to the waterfalls would be just as enjoyable. She wasn't having any of it. In general, we recognize that the attitude displayed in that second cartoon is undesirable. And in health and social care, we talk about person-centered care. In fact, the phrase, I think, has become so routine that we seldom stop to think what we mean by it. The Health Foundation helpfully explains it as follows. Firstly, it's about affording people dignity, compassion, and respect. Secondly, offering coordinated and personalized care, support, or treatment. Thirdly, it's about supporting people to recognize and develop their own strengths and abilities and enable them to live an independent and fulfilling life. In palliative care, we're very good at doing the first two, affording dignity, compassion, and respect, and providing coordinated and personalized care. However, the people that I talk to in the course of the research work that I do who are receiving palliative care services tell me that we're less good at doing the third, at supporting people to recognize and develop their strengths and enable them to live fulfilled lives. And I've learned that an important reason for this is that we're too focused on our patients as the recipients of our care. We don't pay attention to the way in which our attitudes and society's expectations of people who are dying, how these can be immensely disabling. And while we might consciously try to avoid the paternalistic and patronizing attitude in that cartoon, while we are, in the main, kind and caring and supportive people, our beliefs about what patients can and cannot achieve, our ideas about what's realistic and what's not, what's safe and what's not, and how we communicate this to patients, these can exclude people just as much as that flight of stairs. So I want to add to our understanding of rehabilitation. It's not only about enabling people to match their needs and goals and aspirations with their capabilities and resources. It's just as much about overcoming the environmental and attitudinal barriers that limit or prevent participation. So I said at the beginning of the talk that what I wanted to do was to share with you some patients' stories about their experiences of living with disability in the context of advanced illness. And I'm going to draw on some research that I did a few years ago with colleagues. This was a piece of research where we used a multiple case study design with 9 cases, and each case was anchored on an individual patient. I interviewed each patient up to 3 times, firstly at diagnosis and then at subsequent points throughout their illness, up until the time of their death. We contrasted patients' accounts with those of their carers and the health professionals that they identified as having been significant to them, the doctors, nurses, social workers, OTs, and physios. Total of 58 interviews with 45 people. People are great storytellers, and I collected a lot of stories from the people that I talked with. And as I listened to stories, particularly the stories that patients were telling me, I became interested in the way that they used these stories to present themselves and their circumstances in particular ways. I was also interested in how the health professionals had heard and responded to the stories that patients were telling, and following on from that, what the consequences were for what happened next. I'm going to give you some examples of how this worked. And while you're listening to the stories, there are a couple of things I'd like you to bear in mind. When we tell a story, we're not just recounting or describing events. A story is not just about this is what it was like for me. It's also about how I want you to understand it, how I want you to see it. We use stories to explain, to persuade, sometimes to deceive. Stories have a purpose, they have an intent. Also, different people will hear the same story in different ways. Our sympathy for various characters in a story will be shaped by our individual past experiences, by our preferences, by our prejudices. If you like someone and trust them, if their experience fits with your own, you're going to be more inclined to be sympathetic to the story that they're telling you. So let's start with two stories. The first is told by Jill, who was a woman in her mid-40s. She'd been a businesswoman and organised her cancer like she organised the rest of her life. Project plans, lists of things to do, making sure that others understood what she wanted done and how to do it. She organised home care for herself, a stair lift, a wheelchair, her funeral. This is the story she tells about her funeral. Everything's been arranged from A to Z. I've had the funeral directors round, I've chosen my coffin. I did have one problem that was tricky. My mum and dad lived 300 miles away from me and Graham, and it worried me. What's going to happen if I take a turn for the worse? If I get buried here, it's too far for my mum and dad to come if they're feeling they want to grieve one day, and vice versa. Graham. So, although I didn't want to be cremated, I will be. And one casket can be buried back home and one here. I've got all of the practicalities sorted out, the hymns, the music. I've talked to the vicars about how I want the service. So if, God forbid, I take a turn for the worse, the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed on what I want. What's the impression that you get of Jill from this story? Remember what I said earlier, a story is not just an account of events. It invites a response from its audience. It's not simply, this is how it was for me, but how I need this to seem to you. So how does Jill seem to you? I'm going to guess something along the lines of she's capable, a problem solver, well-organized, thoughtful, unselfish, concerned about others. And this is certainly the way that the health professionals she came into contact with heard her story. They accepted her account of herself as positive and coping. In the interviews I did with the staff who worked with her, they said things like, Jill's remained incredibly positive. She was holding it together because that's who she is, a professional lady with a bright outlook on life, the social worker. She's very competent and resourceful. She's overcome a lot of the problems herself. She won't sit there feeling sorry for herself. The specialist nurse. Jill's a great initiator. She knows how to take things forward. You don't wait around for people to do things for you. You get on and do it yourself. Jill had a really positive relationship with the staff that she worked with. The OT had responded quickly and helpfully to her requests for items of equipment, such as the stair lift and a hoist for the bath, and was very respectful of Jill's wishes and preferences. She describes Jill's discharge home. Jill went home adamant that she wanted to be upstairs, which we completely went with because that was her wish. The bath was highly important to her, and there was no way of having a bath downstairs, and she felt that was a better option. I want to contrast Jill's story with that of Eddie. I met 82-year-old Eddie in hospital and interviewed him in the week following his radiotherapy while plans were being made for him to be discharged. He was walking, just precariously. Like Jill, he presents himself as a capable, resourceful problem solver. He tells me about his childhood at some length. I had a happy childhood, he said. I'd go and watch the blacksmith pump his bellows when I was 7. I learned so much that when I got a job at the factory at 14, I knew more than all of the other young starters, so I did really well. Fortunately, I met a good gang of kids. The chaps at work, I always met the best ones. I don't know why, but everything seemed to work out right for me. A friend of a friend in the Merchant Navy helped me to get a job there. The blokes on the ship were really good fellows. They took care of me. I've been to virtually every country in the world. Eddie characterizes himself as adventurous, lucky, resourceful, popular, a survivor. In both his childhood and his adult life, he's had opportunities and good fortune. Things have always worked out well for him, and he invites us to believe, along with him, that they're going to continue to do so in the future. Here, he tells me about how he's going to manage one of his most worrisome problems. 3 o'clock this morning, I'm wide awake because nobody sleeps on a hospital ward, and my head's going round and round. How am I going to get my rice pudding from the kitchen to the table? Main problem. Well, I've got this tea trolley I made years ago. It's got 4 wheels, but if I take the back 2 off, build it up with a bit of wood, so it doesn't slide. There's plenty of timber down the shed, and I'll put on handles, screw them to the side, and I can hold on and walk with my tea trolley. He stands up out of his wheelchair, pitching into my lap as he does so. Push, stop, push, stop. I'm looking forward to going home. It'll be an adventure. The occupational therapist notes a change in Eddie's outlook over time, perceiving him to become less and less willing to compromise. She says, at first, he was realistic, saying he didn't think he would cope at home. But he didn't improve much with radiotherapy, and he got more and more frustrated with us, saying, "You're not ready to go home." The more we talked to him, the less he seemed to understand what we were getting at, that he wouldn't go back to being how he was. Eventually, we said, "You've got options. Go home as you are, but agree not to undertake any kitchen activities." He said he just needed a rail on the work surface, things that we thought weren't so appropriate, because work surfaces aren't meant for such weight-bearing activities. Remember that Eddie has had a life in the Merchant Navy. In a ship's galley, there are rails around the edges of the countertop to stop plates and other things from sliding off. To Eddie, this is the perfect solution. We'll put a rail on the edge of the cracking chipboard of my kitchen countertop, and I can use that to steady myself. There are some interesting differences in the language that Jill and Eddie use. In Eddie's story, we can see this adventurous good fortune. He is speculative. How am I going to? But if I take, I will, I can, I'm looking forward to. It will be an adventure. Eddie talks about how he hopes that things will be. Contrasted with Jill's account, where we can see careful planning and actions already carried out, she's got all of the practicalities sorted out. She's talked to the vicars. Jill's story reassures staff about her competence in a way that Eddie's does not, and the more that staff reject Eddie's account of himself as resourceful and capable, the more entrenched he becomes in his position, the more he digs his heels in. Eddie's determination to hang on to his sense of himself as capable and independent causes the occupational therapist to oppose him even more firmly. We had to be quite assertive with him to make him understand where we were coming from and why we were saying the things we were saying, and that it wasn't to take away his independence. And we can contrast that with the OT's response to Jill. Jill went home adamant that she wanted to be upstairs, which we completely went with because that was her wish. So, how do these stories end? What were the consequences for Jill of having her story accepted and Eddie not? Eddie realized that the only way he was going to get home was to accept what the staff wanted. Once home, he refused all community rehabilitation that was offered. The OT recalls, I asked him whether he wanted me to make a referral to the community services for ongoing rehab at home because I knew that independence was really important to him. He declined, which was a shame, really. I tried to explain that they could carry on the work that we were doing in hospital, but he still didn't want it. I was surprised, actually. I really thought he'd be very keen on that. Eddie struggled at home for a few weeks before being readmitted through A&E to a general medical ward where he died a few weeks later. In Eddie's case, I think, we can see the increasing tension between his view of himself as competent and the staff's sense of him as anything but. Coming back to Jill's situation, we have a different dynamic, but ironically the same outcome. The staff saw Jill as well organised, and they felt they were supporting her independence and autonomy, being very person-centred. In letting her get on with things, Jill hired herself a wheelchair, and the first time she used it was to a busy supermarket on a Saturday morning. She remembers the experience. The first time I used it, it was the wrong move, really, because we went to Tesco and it was busy, and there I was down, in this wheelchair, and I just felt all of these people coming towards me, and it was like I had no control. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying, and I just wanted to get out. She decided that she wouldn't go outdoors anymore. It was too precarious, too risky. In the last year of her life, she became increasingly isolated at home. She had a couple of hospice admissions for low mood and for a pressure sore. She'd had a stairlift installed, so while it was possible for her to get downstairs, she preferred to stay in her bedroom, commenting that on the occasions that she went down to the living room, she felt vulnerable and uncomfortable. In Eddie's case, the staff rejection of his account of himself as competent led him to refusing further support. In Jill's case, their acceptance of her as capable and resourceful meant that interventions beyond the provision of equipment were not offered. Our attitudes to patients, our beliefs about what they can and cannot achieve, our ideas about what's realistic and feasible and what's not, and how we communicate these have consequences, often unintended, but they have consequences for people's social participation. So Jill and Eddie were 2 of the 9 patients we followed in our research study, and from the data we collected, we were able to develop a model of how patients respond to disability. In essence, we found that patients' orientation to disability incorporates 2 apparently inconsistent attitudes. There are ways in which people acknowledge the problems that arise out of disability. They recognize that something significant has changed and that they'll need to learn new skills for looking after themselves. The need to work out what they can and can't do, to find useful information about how to manage. But there's also another side to this. At the same time as they recognize that life has changed, they contrive not to recognize that fact. And we see a determination to hold on to an established identity which is associated with a sense of normality. Now, normal is a problematic word and concept, and I'm using it here as one patient described, to refer to the person that I am accustomed to being, unencumbered by this illness. There's an obvious tension between these 2 dimensions, and we found that patients adopted one or more of a series of psychological strategies designed to reduce the tension between these 2 inconsistent states of mind. They twin-track their inconsistent attitudes, running them in parallel rather than examining the relationship between them. They revise downwards their expectations, response shift. They constantly defer anticipated pleasures, avoiding situations in which their abilities might be put to the test. Here, one of the other patients, Ben, gives an account in which he acknowledges his situation, working out what's possible, worrying about his abilities. I'm realizing there are limits, and it's a tough thing to bear. I sit in the house and I feel okay, and I think, yes, I can do it. But when I go out after 100 meters, I feel very weak, and I can't just sit down in the street. I tried to walk up to the doctors the other day, and I couldn't make it. That's an awful thing to surrender yourself to. You can't get around anymore. So I'm just working out the boundaries, seeing what I can do and what I can't, and I think I'm quite disappointed at what I can't do. In a later interview, he reflects on wanting to avoid being seen as a cancer patient, a sick person. Everyone's very supportive and kind and stuff, but no one treats you like a mate anymore, and that's what I wanted to avoid for as long as possible. I think what I wanted to preserve was the absolute preciousness of normality. Here's an example of response shift where Ben revises over time his notions about what constitutes a tolerable way of life. In my first interview with him, very shortly after his diagnosis of metastatic spinal cord compression, he says, "I can still walk, so I'm all right. I mean, if I had to be in a wheelchair, it would be just terrible." 5 months later, He was a regular wheelchair user, and he says, because see, getting out in the wheelchair, if we discussed this last November, I would have been in tears. Now it's an absolute joy to go out in a wee wheelchair. So it's just crept up on me. It's not a big issue. But he imagines life again in the future and is concerned about further loss of function. At the minute I'm walking and getting into the chair, if there was a dependence, if I couldn't get up the stairs or I couldn't get out of the seat, I can't imagine what that would be like. I interviewed Ben for the last time about 2 weeks before he died. At that stage, he was at home. Bed moved downstairs into his living room and enjoying the company of friends who had keys to his front door, would let themselves in to visit, to bring food, drink beer. The goals that patients described that they wanted to achieve could appear contradictory. As I've explained, they would acknowledge the problem and make practical plans to deal with it, while at the same time plan to do things that they were clearly quite incapable of doing. And these inconsistent plans were sometimes described simultaneously. Another example. Here's Ian's account of having to give up one activity for which, on the grounds that his balance is now very poor, but showing a determination to succeed in another for which exceptionally good balance is required. I've had to give up my allotment, his vegetable garden, which makes me feel sad. I can't move without a walking frame anymore, but I have 2 or 3 ambitions that I will achieve. It's not a question of wanting to, I am going to achieve them. And the first one is the essence of being independent and standing alone, is I want to go and hit a golf ball, a full swing, followed by a hole. On one hand, Ian understands the practical limitations of his illness. He can't manage his vegetable garden any longer. He doesn't have the balance to dig. But it doesn't stop him from holding on to the idea that at some point in the future, it's going to be possible for him to engage in another favourite activity, even though the physical ability needed for playing golf exceeds his current capacities by some distance. And he knows and accepts that he has a deteriorating illness. The idea that it could be possible is comforting. And having this aspiration for the future enables him to keep in touch with a sense of himself as a sociable person, a golfer, somebody who is skillful and active. We can see this hope as being connected with a positive self-identity and having little to do, perhaps, with actual achievement. So people find ways to cope with disability. Some of the ways they do this are by not acknowledging that it's happening. The way we listen to their stories has us reaching for labels like they're in denial or they're unrealistic, rather than seeing what's going on as a complex response to the circumstances that they find themselves in. And this has consequences for the support that we offer. In palliative care, we want to support people to live well while they are dying. Let's think for a moment what living well means. Not for our patients, for us. We're all human beings. What enables us to live well? We can identify a range of factors, and here are some examples. Social support, hope, faith, our perception of our social worth. Linking this up to what I was saying earlier about what's important to people at the end of life, a sense of control, achievement, and self-worth. The one that I want to pick out is that one. We all need to believe that we're capable of achieving the things that are important to us. We need to feel reasonably good about ourselves in order to make it possible for us to get out of bed in the mornings. Now, I'm a university lecturer, so I do quite a lot of teaching. And to do that, I have to be able to stand up in front of classes of scary students. I have to believe I'm not terribly bad at it. I might be, but that's besides the point. It's about my perception of myself. How do I develop and reinforce a sense of myself as a capable and competent teacher? So one of the ways is to look for feedback from others. We do it all the time without even being aware of it. This situation is not too dissimilar to teaching. So I'm paying attention to those of you who are looking attentive and smiling. Thank you very much. And thinking that, well, those of you who are on your iPads and your phones, you're probably on Twitter, not on your email. I'm probably, without even being aware of it, though, screening out people who are looking bored or disgruntled or falling asleep. And people living with life-limiting illnesses look for the same cues from their friends and their families and from us. It's not just about positive feedback when somebody's managed to get from a chair to a bed well, although that's important. It's actively looking for ways to acknowledge other people as important, capable, interesting, worthwhile, worth talking to. Letting Eddie know that we appreciate that he's a carpenter, a handyman, someone who's inventive, problem-solving, resourceful. As healthcare professionals, we can be very concerned about supporting patients' aspirations when we feel they're unrealistic. While it's neither helpful nor appropriate to be falsely encouraging, it's also not necessary to undermine the strategies that people use to maintain a sense of themselves as competent, worthwhile individuals. American psychologist Shelley Taylor, her work shows how normal human perception and behavior is characterized by a tendency towards positive illusions, which are mild distortions in reality where we hold unrealistically positive views of ourselves, exaggerate perceptions of personal control, and we're unrealistically optimistic. Moreover, these positive illusions appear to have protective psychological effects which contribute significantly to a person's ability to adjust to threatening events. In the context of a deteriorating condition, responding to a person's desire for independence, a need for a sense of competence, needs some careful thought. It can be helpful to focus on activity and participation as a means to foster an independence of spirit, rather than to achieve mastery of particular tasks. The most valuable outcomes of rehabilitation towards the end of life might be possibilities or feasibilities, rather than specific achievements. So, how do we do this? It's relatively easy to understand how environmental barriers can be removed, but attitudes and perceptions are much harder. When patients' expectations, goals, and aspirations seem to be at odds with their capabilities and resources, how can we respond in a way that's positive and constructive, but at the same time grounded and realistic? One of my colleagues, Mary Miller, at Sobel House Hospice in Oxford, where I worked for many years, talks about listening generously when we listen to patients' stories, and I think that this is a helpful concept. Rather than one's first response being to the content of what's being communicated, respond instead, at least initially, to the values that are being presented. Instead of being focused on how am I going to respond to what I'm hearing, first try to understand. What's this person telling me about what's significant and important to them? What does it tell me about their sense of themselves, their hopes and expectations for the future? And crucially, what assumptions am I making here about what's possible and what's realistic? Rather than a model of an expert professional hearing and solving patients' problems, we're aiming rather for this. Providing a sounding board, asking the right questions, making it possible for people to recognize and develop their own strengths and abilities. So in this talk, I've argued that the purpose of a rehabilitation approach in palliative care is to enable people to participate in the activities that are important to them. I've suggested that there are ways in which environmental, social, and attitudinal barriers can hinder people's participation in family, community, and social life. I've proposed that attending to the assumptions we're making about what's realistic and feasible and possible for people to hope for or to achieve can help us to communicate more effectively, and that listening generously provides a helpful framework for doing this. I have one last account from an interview I did with Ian, the vegetable gardener and the golfer, who's struggling at this point to stand and walk and is increasingly reliant on a wheelchair. He's telling me about his plans to travel with Irene, his wife. Irene and I have always been great caravanners. I don't want the bother of a caravan anymore, so I've just recently bought myself a camper van, which means that Irene and I can still go away for weekends. I'm organising some modifications for it. I'm going to sort out power steering, and I'll have one of those knobs on the steering wheel, like the old truck drivers used to have. That should sort it out. I believe I'll have enough movement in my feet to operate the clutch. I think that should work. And he looks at me. Don't you? And this is where listening generously flies out of the window. We're not thinking, what does this represent to you, Ian? What are you telling me about what's significant, important to you? We're thinking, you're going to kill people and it's going to be my fault because I didn't stop you. But if that's the first thing we address, our concerns about safety, we're jeopardizing the very thing that makes rehabilitation and palliative care so powerful and so useful and so important, the ability to support and enable a person's sense of themselves as worthwhile. We need to acknowledge Ian's love of camping. We could ask him about what's important to him, what kinds of things he'd like to be able to do. And we might learn, for example, that being outdoors and close to nature is very important, that spending time with his wife is important. We could learn that in the short term he'd be happy going out for a few hours to a local park. He'd be happy for his wife to drive in their car rather than taking out the camper van. He might still want to look forward to going camping and to playing golf, but for now, to have satisfaction and enjoyment in the short term, we can work with the plans and the compromises that he's willing to make. This last slide is a painting by Gustav Klimt, and I'm sure many of you know it. It's called Life and Death, and I think it very beautifully illustrates the tension we're working with in making it possible for people with life-limiting illness to live well, simultaneously acknowledging and preparing for death and supporting and affirming patients' joy and pleasure in everyday life. If we're going to enable people's participation, we need to take the time to find out what their priorities are, what really matters to them, what they want to do, not just what they need to do. If our interest only extends as far as someone's basic hygiene, feeding, and safety needs, we're not doing a very good job. We need to respond to the stories that patients tell us in a way that supports and affirms their sense of themselves as interesting and worthwhile and useful human beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. That was just amazing and really challenged us on our attitudinal barriers. And I feel personally I'll take away the message that I need to think about my response to people in my care and what my intent is in my response. I'm sure that there are those of you who've got questions, and if you have, could you make your way to the mics? And we've got roving mics in the room. Thank you. We'll take.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Claude Regnard from St Oswald's Hospice in Newcastle and Wirral St John's down here. I was very interested. Sorry, I'm over here.
The lights are bright
and
the sound's not focused. I'm really sorry, Claude, and hello.
It's all right. Hello. I was very interested by your slide between acknowledging and not acknowledging, and I was struck by the similarity of that to the theories around grief.
Absolutely.
And I wondered whether you'd explored the similarities between grief and the losses resulting from disability.
The extent to which I have and would have liked to explore, I've read a lot around it, and I can see the similarity with Strobe and Scott's model of grief, where it fluctuates between two positions rather than being a stage model. We spent quite a bit of time applying for a further NIHR Research for Patient Benefit grant to try and take this work further. It was incredibly difficult, and the route that my research has now taken is in supporting people to get back to work, where you can see the economic and social benefits are greater. But I would love to be able to do some more work on that and look at the similarities between those two models, and particularly around our conceptual understanding of how people respond to disability in the context of life-limiting illness.
Do you have any other questions?
Thank you for your presentation. It was fascinating. I'm Carrick Brain. I'm the Senior Care Services Manager at New Life Foundation for Disabled Children. And I'm really interested to understand whether you believe that attitudinal barriers actually create environmental barriers, whether there's a cause and effect.
Create environmental barriers. I mean, I think by, yes, yeah. I think that in palliative care, our perceptions and expectations of what people who are dying should do or should be, what are our concepts of adults, children as they are dying? What do we reasonably expect them to be doing? So, you know, our expectation was that my mother-in-law would reasonably go for the flat walk along the river to the waterfall with all of the other 87-year-old ladies and not go to the top of a mountain. I think our ideas about what dying people should do and should be limit their participation. So yes, I do think that our attitudes contribute to wider social and environmental barriers.
And are there significant differences between adult and childcare, do you think, in that respect?
Hard for me to know. Palliative care with children is outside of my field, so I would feel, I think, probably a little uncomfortable in trying to say anything authoritative.
Thank you.
We've got time for one last question, if there is one.
Hi, thank you. That was a really interesting talk. My name's Karen Clark. I'm from St Wilfrid's Hospice in Eastbourne. I'm interested in whether you've got any insights into the approach of carers when a loved one wants to do more than they're actually capable of. Certainly the work we've been doing around rehabilitative palliative care is that the patient wants to do more, but their spouse is frightened, concerned, and often that may be the barrier that prevents the individual from doing what they may want to do.
Absolutely, and it's a topic for another talk, but I was focusing on, I mean, in order to get the message home, I'm sort of oversimplifying something and focusing on this is what the interaction is with patients, because I think we do need to start there and recognize how our responses to people can be disabling. But of course, patients aren't patients on their own, and that's the whole purpose of this. They're part of a network. And what patients want is different to what we want, is different to what their carers want, is, you know, different to the resources that are available to them. And it is a whole complex network. But I think trying to help people to, so in that situation where you've got a carer and a patient with, and a carer very concerned, we were tremendously concerned about my mother-in-law walking down off Sugarloaf in a howling gale, and it was all I could do not to stand behind her and hang on to her belt so that she didn't fall over. But helping carers to see that we need to find a compromise here. We need to find a way that makes it possible for my mum-in-law to walk off that mountain thinking, I'm a mountaineer. I'm not an old lady who goes for flat walks by the canal.
Thank you. And while we express our thanks again, can I invite Heather to join us?
Can I have the slide, please? Good afternoon, friends, colleagues. Two quick but important announcements. The first is a date for your diary. Anyone committed to perpetuating Dame Cicely Saunders' visionary and pioneering approach to the development and delivery of hospice and palliative care needs to come to this conference, jointly organised by Hospice UK, St Christopher's and the Royal Society of Medicine. It marks our 50th birthday, that of St Christopher's and the modern hospice movement, and it's about preparing us for the next 50 years and our success there. We're going to feature BJ Miller. He's hitherto unknown to the UK. He's a great speaker. If you haven't heard of him, watch his TED Talk. You'll be surprised. And there are other good people, expensive people too, that you'll hear. Most importantly, a plug for the new #1 Christmas single. Yes, you've heard it here first. 18 hospices in London, over 300 patients, families, staff and volunteers come together to create lovely noise and tell an important story of the care that we all provide. The generosity, the leadership, the vision of Royal Trinity Hospice are notable. The collaboration on this has been fantastic. Your chance to do your bit now. How can you help? Please buy it. It's cheap at the price. Buy it for other people that you like. Tell them about it. Use social media. Tell them verbally. We all stand to benefit. And there are some people here from Royal Trinity who can give you more information. Can you just identify yourselves? Somebody up there. I know Megan's here and a number of others. But a great piece of work, and you've got a chance now to have the first preview. Thank you.
Every generation blames the one before, and all of their frustration come beating on your door. I know that I'm a prisoner to all my father held so dear. Know that I'm a hostage to all his hopes and fears. Wish I could have told him in the living years. Crumble bits of paper filled with imperfect thoughts, still to conversation. I'm afraid that's all we've got. You say you just don't see it. You say there's perfect sense. You just can't get agreement in this present tense. We all talk a different language, talking in defense. Say it loud. Say it loud. Say it clear. Come on, say it clear. Listen as well as you hear, 'cause it's too late. It's too late. Too late when we die. We don't see eye to eye. So we open up a quarrel between the present and the past. We only sacrifice the future. And it's the bitterness that lasts. You don't yield to the fortune. You sometimes see his fate. May have a new perspective on a different day. If you don't give up and don't give in, you may just be okay. Yeah. Say it loud. Say it loud. Say it clear. Listen as well as you hear, because it's too late. Oh, I caught his spirit later that same year. Sure, I heard his echo in my baby's newborn tears. I wish I could have told it in the living years. Say it loud. Say it loud. Go on, say it there. Listen as well as you hear. You know that it's too